Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Pacific Northwest. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the dense primeval forests of Northern California, where the redwoods tower like ancient sentinels and the mist clings to the undergrowth long past noon, there exists a case that has remained in the shadows of American folklore for over a century. The disappearance of Thomas Crawford, a respected photographer from San Francisco, might have been forgotten entirely if not for a single photograph found among his abandoned equipment near the settlement of Willow Creek in the spring of 1903. The photograph itself was unremarkable at first glance, a blurred image of what appeared to be a large, upright figure at the edge of a clearing. What made this case extraordinary was not just Crawford's subsequent disappearance, but the methodical way in which his identity seemed to be erased from public record in the months following the incident. According to the Humboldt County Historical Society archives, which were partially damaged in a courthouse fire in 1962, official inquiries into Crawford's whereabouts were mysteriously halted within 6 weeks of his disappearance. Local newspaper reports from the Humboldt Times mention Crawford's arrival in the area in March of 1903, describing him as a gentleman of scientific disposition with peculiar theories regarding the wildlife of our remote regions. Crawford had established himself as a nature photographer of some renown in San Francisco, specializing in landscape photography and, occasionally, capturing images of wildlife in their natural habitats. His work had appeared in several scientific journals of the time, and he had developed a reputation for venturing into areas that other photographers considered too remote or treacherous. What few people knew about Crawford was his background before photography. According to records uncovered decades later, he had served briefly as a field researcher for the Smithsonian Institution in the late 1890s, participating in biological surveys throughout the Pacific Northwest. His employment was terminated under circumstances that remain unclear, though correspondence in the Smithsonian archives suggests some disagreement with his supervisors regarding research priorities. One letter written by Crawford to the department head in 1898 contains a cryptic reference to anomalous biological specimens that he believed warranted further investigation, but which his superiors had dismissed as irrelevant to the survey's objectives. After leaving the Smithsonian, Crawford established his photography business in San Francisco, where he primarily supported himself through portrait work and architectural photography. However, his true passion remained the documentation of remote wilderness areas and their inhabitants. His published works from this period reveal a methodical mind with an eye for detail, particularly in his series on the wildlife of the Sierra Nevada mountains, which was praised for its technical precision and scientific value. What led Crawford to the isolated woodlands near Willow Creek remains a subject of speculation. His last known correspondence, a letter sent to his publisher in San Francisco, dated April 2, 1903, mentioned his intention to document what he referred to as anomalous bipedal fauna that had been described to him by local timber workers. The letter, preserved in the archives of the California Historical Society until it was transferred to microfilm in 1958, reveals a man consumed by a singular purpose, yet remarkably clear-headed about his methodology. "I have secured lodging at the Richardson homestead," wrote Crawford, approximately 7 miles from where the most recent sightings have occurred. "Mr. Richardson, though skeptical of my purpose here, has been generous enough to provide me with detailed directions to the location where the timbermen claim to have observed the creature. I have prepared my equipment accordingly, with particular attention to the new flash powder apparatus, which should allow for clearer exposures in the dim light beneath the canopy." The letter continues with a passage that would later be cited by skeptics as evidence of Crawford's deteriorating mental state. I am increasingly convinced that what inhabits these forests represents not merely an undocumented species, but a missing link in our understanding of primate evolution. The descriptions provided by witnesses, the height, the gait, the apparent intelligence, suggest a creature that occupies a taxonomic position of profound significance. If I am correct, this discovery will fundamentally alter zoological classification and perhaps even our conception of humanity's place in the natural order. The Richardson homestead, according to county records, was a modest property owned by Elias Richardson, a retired logger who had settled in the area in the 1880s. The homestead itself no longer exists, having been reclaimed by the forest sometime in the 1940s after being abandoned for decades. What remains is a clearing where the foundation once stood, marked only by a few scattered stones and the remnants of what might have been a well. Elias Richardson was known locally as a man of practical disposition, not given to flights of fancy or superstition. His decision to accommodate Crawford surprised many in the small community, as he had previously expressed disdain for what he called curiosity seekers, who occasionally ventured into the area in search of the rumored forest creatures. According to local accounts, Richardson's attitude toward these rumors was dismissive, but not entirely skeptical. A statement attributed to him in a Humboldt Times article from 1901 reads, "I don't know what walks in these woods after dark, and I don't much care to find out. Best to leave some corners of this world undisturbed." What changed Richardson's mind regarding Crawford remains unclear. In his statement to the sheriff following the photographer's disappearance, Richardson mentioned only that Crawford had presented himself as a serious scientific investigator rather than a thrill-seeker, and that he had offered generous compensation for lodging and local knowledge. Some researchers have suggested that Richardson might have had his own encounters with the unexplained during his years as a logger, encounters that left him more open to Crawford's inquiries than he publicly acknowledged. Crawford's arrival at the Richardson property was noted by several residents of the nearby settlement. Martha Thornton, whose journal was discovered among her possessions after her death in 1951, wrote of the photographer's arrival, "The stranger came today with his many cases and contraptions. Mr. Richardson has put him up in the old cabin past the creek. There is something in his manner that unsettles me, a certain intensity in his gaze when he speaks of his work. He asked many questions about the forests beyond Redwood Creek, particularly about the sounds people have reported hearing there after sunset." Thornton's journal entries over the following weeks track Crawford's activities from the perspective of a curious but wary observer. She notes his daily departures into the forest, usually at dawn, and his returns at dusk, often appearing weary but animated by some inner excitement. On April 10th, she writes, "The photographer returned today with an unusual expression, something between triumph and fear. He spoke briefly with Elias on the porch, their voices too low to make out their words, but their manner suggested they discussed something of great importance. Later, I observed the photographer cleaning his lenses with unusual care, as if preparing for something significant." For the next 3 weeks, Crawford ventured daily into the surrounding woodland, carrying his heavy photographic equipment, with the assistance of a local guide, James Blackwood, a young man of mixed Native American and European descent who knew the area intimately. According to statements later given to the county sheriff and preserved in fragmented reports, Blackwood accompanied Crawford on all but his final expedition. Blackwood's role in the Crawford case has been the subject of considerable speculation. As one of the last people to see the photographer alive, his testimony formed a critical part of the official investigation. Yet aspects of his account have been questioned by later researchers, particularly his insistence that he had no prior knowledge of the creatures Crawford was seeking, despite his heritage and lifelong residence in an area where stories of such beings were common among indigenous populations. "He became different after we found the tracks," Blackwood reportedly told Sheriff William Mercer in late April 1903. We came upon them near the North Fork of the creek, where the ground stays soft, even in dry weather. They were like a man's, but much larger, and the stride was longer than any human could manage. Mr. Crawford spent hours photographing them and making plaster casts. After that, he wouldn't speak during our journeys, just walked with his eyes fixed ahead, as if expecting something to emerge from between the trees at any moment. In a separate statement recorded by Deputy Sheriff Lang, but omitted from the official report, Blackwood allegedly added, "There were places he wanted to go that I warned against, areas the old people say belong to the forest beings. He didn't listen. Said science didn't recognize such boundaries." The day before he went missing, we found broken branches high up on the trees, 15 feet or more above the ground. Fresh breaks, with sap still running. No bear or cat could do that. I told him we should turn back, but he just made notes in his book and took more photographs. The plaster casts mentioned by Blackwood were never recovered. They were listed among Crawford's possessions in an inventory, taken when his camp was discovered abandoned, but by the time the items were transferred to the county seat in Eureka, the casts were no longer among them. The inventory, signed by Deputy Sheriff Thomas Lang on April 29, 1903, notes their absence with the simple annotation, "Missing during transit." This was the first of many instances where evidence related to the Crawford case would inexplicably vanish. The pattern would become so pronounced in later years that researcher Robert Lindstrom coined the term Crawford syndrome to describe the tendency of documentation related to the case to disappear or become inaccessible once public attention was directed toward it. On April 17, 1903, Crawford set out alone into the forest, having told Blackwood the previous evening that he preferred to work without assistance for this particular expedition. According to Blackwood's statement, Crawford seemed unusually agitated that evening, repeatedly checking his equipment and consulting a hand-drawn map that he refused to show to his guide. "He told me he was close to something significant," Blackwood stated. "He said the sounds were getting closer each night and that whatever was making them seemed to be circling the cabin. I offered to accompany him regardless of the danger, but he was insistent that he go alone." His exact words were, "Some things are better witnessed in solitude." What Blackwood omitted from his official statement, but later confided to Martha Thornton according to her journal, was that Crawford had spent much of that final evening writing letters, which he sealed and entrusted to Richardson for mailing should he not return within 3 days. These letters were reportedly addressed to colleagues in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., but like so much else connected to the case, they never reached their destinations. Richardson would later claim that he had indeed posted the letters as requested, but no trace of them has ever been found in the archives of the individuals or institutions to whom they were allegedly addressed. Crawford never returned to the Richardson homestead. After 2 days without word from the photographer, Blackwood and Elias Richardson ventured into the forest following the route Crawford was known to favor. Approximately 4 miles from the homestead, in a small clearing beside a stream that feeds into Redwood Creek, they discovered what remained of Crawford's camp. The scene, as described in Richardson's subsequent statement to Sheriff Mercer, was one of apparent disarray, though notably without signs of violence or struggle. Crawford's tent remained erect, his bedroll untouched inside. His provisions were still packed in their oilskin wrappers. Most significantly, his photographic equipment was found arranged precisely on a fallen log, the camera itself, several exposed plates, carefully stored in their protective cases, his tripod folded and secured with leather straps, and his notebook open to a blank page, a pencil laid across it as if he had been preparing to make an entry when interrupted. The only sign of disturbance was a series of indentations in the soft earth around the perimeter of the clearing, described by Richardson as enormous footprints, easily 16 inches in length, pressed deep into the soil as if made by something of considerable weight. Blackwood, in his separate statement, corroborated this observation, but added a detail that Richardson had omitted. The prints came from the north side of the clearing, circled the camp, and then returned in the same direction, but with a different stride pattern, as if whatever made them had been carrying something on its return journey. This detail, the implication that Crawford might have been carried away, rather than wandering off, was downplayed in the official investigation but would become a central element in later accounts of the disappearance. It suggested an intent and purpose behind his vanishing that contradicted the official conclusion of accidental death or voluntary departure. When the sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene the following day, a steady rain had been falling for hours. The footprints described by Richardson and Blackwood had largely been washed away, with only 2 partial impressions remaining visible enough to be documented. Deputy Lang's report describes these as unusual depressions larger than a man's foot, but too degraded by rainfall to determine their precise nature or origin. Crawford's equipment was collected and transported to Eureka, where it was held as evidence in what was initially treated as a missing person case. Among the exposed photographic plates, only one contained an image that could be developed successfully. The others, according to the county clerk's records, were fogged or otherwise compromised, yielding no discernible images upon development. The single viable photograph showed what appeared to be a large upright figure, partially obscured by undergrowth at the edge of a clearing. The image was blurred, suggesting movement at the moment of exposure, but distinct enough to discern an outline that was decidedly not human in its proportions. The figure appeared to be covered in dark hair or fur, with an estimated height, based on comparison with the surrounding trees, of approximately 7 to 8 feet. This photograph became the center of the investigation into Crawford's disappearance, though opinions varied wildly as to what exactly it depicted. Sheriff Mercer, in his official report dated May 12, 1903, expressed the view that the image most likely showed a bear standing on its hind legs, distorted by the limitations of Mr. Crawford's photographic technique and the poor lighting conditions of the forest. Others who viewed the photograph were less convinced by this explanation. Alan Morrison, a biology professor at the newly established Humboldt State Normal School, now Humboldt State University, was invited to examine the image. His written assessment, preserved in university archives, states, "While I cannot definitively identify the subject of this photograph, I can state with reasonable certainty that it does not depict any known species of bear indigenous to this region. The proportions of the limbs, particularly the length of the arms relative to the torso, are inconsistent with ursine anatomy. Furthermore, the posture suggests a creature naturally bipedal rather than one temporarily assuming an upright stance." Morrison's assessment went on to note several other anomalies in the photograph that had been overlooked in the official report. The figure appears to be holding something in its right hand, possibly a branch or stick. This implies not merely bipedal locomotion, but manual dexterity and potentially tool use. Additionally, what can be discerned of the head suggests a pronounced sagittal crest, a feature found in great apes but not in bears. While I hesitate to make definitive claims based on a single, somewhat obscured photograph, the evidence suggests a primate rather than an ursid subject. Morrison's conclusions were controversial, even within academic circles. His department head at Humboldt State reportedly discouraged further public comment on the matter, concerned that the institution's reputation might suffer from association with what many regarded as a hoax or case of misidentification. Morrison complied with this directive but continued to study the photograph privately, making detailed notes that would later become part of Lindstrom's research materials. As news of the photograph and Crawford's disappearance spread beyond Humboldt County, the case began to attract attention from various quarters. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle, Edward Harrington, traveled to Eureka in late May to investigate the story. His subsequent article, published June 3, 1903, presented a largely skeptical account of the affair, suggesting that Crawford had either staged the photograph as a hoax before deliberately disappearing to generate publicity for a forthcoming book, or had met with a more mundane accident in the treacherous terrain and would likely be found deceased once a more thorough search was conducted. Harrington's article is notable for its dismissive tone toward local witnesses, particularly those of Native American descent. He characterized their accounts of forest creatures as primitive superstitions that have found a regrettable foothold even among the more educated settlers of the region. This attitude reflected broader cultural biases of the era, but also served to undermine the credibility of testimonies that might otherwise have lent support to the existence of the creatures Crawford had sought to document. Harrington's article marked a turning point in the public narrative surrounding the case. Within weeks of its publication, interest in Crawford's disappearance began to wane. The sheriff's office, facing pressure to resolve more pressing cases, gradually reduced the resources allocated to the search. By mid-July, the investigation had been effectively suspended, with Crawford officially classified as missing, presumed deceased, due to misadventure in wilderness conditions. What happened next is where the case takes its most disturbing turn. In August 1903, a fire broke out in the records room of the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office. While quickly contained, the fire damaged numerous documents, including portions of the Crawford case file. The photograph, which had been stored separately in an evidence locker, reportedly survived intact. However, when Dr. Morrison requested to examine it again in September, he was informed that the photograph had been transferred to the U.S. Forest Service office in San Francisco for further analysis. No record of this transfer exists in the surviving sheriff's office documentation. Moreover, inquiries made to the Forest Service in 1957 by historian Robert Lindstrom revealed no evidence that the agency had ever received or analyzed the photograph. The official response to Lindstrom's inquiry stated simply, "No records pertaining to a photographer named Thomas Crawford or photographs of unidentified wildlife from Humboldt County in 1903 exist in the National Archives or Forest Service historical collections." This discrepancy marked the beginning of what some researchers have termed the institutional amnesia surrounding the Crawford case. Records that should have existed were missing. Transfers that should have been documented were untraceable. Agencies that should have retained files claimed no knowledge of the matter. Whether the result of bureaucratic incompetence, deliberate suppression, or some combination of the two, the effect was the same. The evidence of what Crawford had encountered in the forests of Humboldt County was systematically vanishing from official records. The curious case of the missing photograph might have remained a mere footnote in the larger mystery of Crawford's disappearance, if not for a series of events that occurred in the winter of 1904-1905. Beginning in November 1904, residents of the Willow Creek area reported a succession of unusual occurrences. Livestock found dead with precise, almost surgical injuries, strange vocalizations echoing through the valleys at night, and most notably, a series of footprints discovered in snow-covered clearings that matched the description of those found at Crawford's abandoned camp. These incidents, documented in the journals of several local residents and occasionally reported in the Humboldt Times, continued sporadically until February 1905, when they abruptly ceased. The cessation coincided with the arrival of a group of men who identified themselves as government surveyors, but whose behavior struck many locals as peculiar. Martha Thornton's journal entry from February 10, 1905, reads, "The men who claimed to be surveying the forest spent the day asking questions about the sounds and tracks people have reported. They showed no interest in property boundaries or timber quality. One of them, a tall man with a severe expression, asked specifically about Crawford and whether anyone had found additional photographs or papers belonging to him. When I mentioned the strange tracks Jacob found near his sheep pen last week, the man exchanged a look with his companions that made me deeply uneasy." Thornton's journal entries for the following weeks describe an atmosphere of increasing tension in the community. The surveyors remained in the area for nearly a month, conducting what they described as standard geodetic measurements, but spending much of their time interviewing local residents about their experiences in the forest and collecting any physical evidence related to the reported creatures. They took the plaster cast Jacob had made of the track, Thornton wrote on February 23rd, offered him $20 for it, which he could hardly refuse, given the hard winter we've had. They asked if anyone else had similar items or had made drawings of what they'd seen in the woods. Their manner was polite, but left no room for refusal. Mrs. Blackwood tells me they spent 3 hours at her home yesterday, questioning James about his time with the photographer. She says James has been quiet since they left, refusing to discuss what they asked or what he told them. According to county records, no official government survey was scheduled for the area during that time period. When Lindstrom attempted to identify these men through government employment records in the course of his 1957 investigation, he found no evidence of a surveying party dispatched to Humboldt County in early 1905. The identity and purpose of these surveyors remain one of the most intriguing aspects of the Crawford case. Some researchers have suggested that they represented an early example of government suppression of cryptid evidence, a precursor to what would later be alleged in connection with Bigfoot sightings during the mid-20th century. Others have proposed more mundane explanations, that they might have been private investigators hired by Crawford's family or associates, or perhaps representatives of a scientific institution conducting covert research. Whatever their actual identity, their arrival marked the end of the unusual occurrences that had plagued the Willow Creek area since Crawford's disappearance. After their departure in March 1905, no further reports of strange tracks or sounds appeared in local records for several years. It was as if whatever had been disturbed by Crawford's presence had either departed or retreated deeper into the wilderness, beyond the reach of human observation. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Crawford case emerged during Lindstrom's research. As he attempted to trace Crawford's life prior to his arrival in Humboldt County, he discovered an unsettling pattern. Records that should have existed were missing, altered, or contradictory. The San Francisco photography studio where Crawford reportedly worked had no employment records for him, despite several contemporary accounts mentioning his association with the establishment. City directories from 1900-1902 contained no listings for Thomas Crawford, though a photographer by that name had been mentioned in several newspaper articles during the same period. Most notably, when Lindstrom attempted to locate Crawford's published works in the scientific journals where they had reportedly appeared, he found no photographs credited to Crawford, nor any mention of his contributions. It was as if someone had systematically erased Thomas Crawford from public record, leaving behind only the most tenuous evidence of his existence. Lindstrom's notes from this period reflect growing frustration and confusion. It defies explanation how thoroughly Crawford has been removed from documentation. Even the Smithsonian, where he was reportedly employed in the 1890s, claims to have no personnel records matching his description. Yet I have held in my hands a letter on Smithsonian letterhead dated 1897, bearing his signature as Field Researcher, Department of Zoological Collections. When I presented this letter to the institution's archivist, I was told it must be a forgery, as their records are complete and contain no mention of any Thomas Crawford. The letter Lindstrom referenced was part of a small collection of Crawford's personal correspondence that had been preserved by a former colleague, Professor Walter Hammond of Berkeley. Hammond had met Crawford during a biological survey expedition in Oregon in 1896 and had maintained occasional contact with him until 1902. When interviewed by Lindstrom in 1957, Hammond expressed bewilderment at the difficulty of tracing Crawford's career. He was not an obscure figure in scientific circles, Hammond stated. His photographic techniques for wildlife documentation were innovative, and his paper on nocturnal mammals of the Pacific Coast was widely discussed when it appeared in 1901. I still have my copy of the journal with Crawford's article and photographs clearly credited. Yet, when I attempted to access the journal's archives last year for an unrelated matter, that particular issue was listed as damaged and unavailable, and the repository's index made no mention of Crawford's contribution. Hammond's testimony added another layer to the mystery, not merely the disappearance of a man, but the apparent erasure of his professional legacy. This aspect of the case has led some researchers to suggest that Crawford might have encountered something in the Humboldt forests that certain interests, whether governmental, scientific, or otherwise, were determined to keep from public knowledge, even to the extent of removing all traces of the man who documented it. Lindstrom's investigation came to an abrupt end in January 1958. While traveling to interview James Blackwood, who was then living in a nursing home in Arcata, Lindstrom's car veered off Highway 101 near Orick and crashed into a ravine. He was found deceased at the scene, his research materials scattered across the highway. According to the California Highway Patrol report, the accident was attributed to driver error, possibly due to fog conditions, though the weather station at Crescent City had recorded clear visibility throughout the region that day. The materials recovered from Lindstrom's vehicle were returned to his widow, who subsequently donated them to the Humboldt County Historical Society. However, when researchers attempted to access these materials in the 1970s, they were informed that the collection had been damaged by water leakage in 1968, and much of it had been discarded due to mold contamination. What remains are fragments, photocopies of some newspaper articles, partial transcripts of interviews, and Lindstrom's handwritten notes, many of which are now illegible due to water damage. One legible section of Lindstrom's notes, dated December 18, 1957, contains a troubling observation. The pattern is unmistakable. Each person who has pursued this case too vigorously has either abandoned their inquiry under unexplained circumstances or met with misfortune. Jenkins in 38, Sorensen in 42. Now this business with Morrison's stroke, just days after he agreed to share his original notes with me, I cannot escape the feeling that some agency is actively suppressing information about Crawford and what he discovered in those woods. The reference to Morrison relates to Dr. Alan Morrison, who had examined the original photograph in 1903. Morrison suffered a debilitating stroke in December 1957, shortly after corresponding with Lindstrom about the case. He never recovered sufficiently to communicate clearly again and passed away in March 1958, his personal papers regarding the Crawford case having vanished from his university office sometime between his hospitalization and death. The other names mentioned by Lindstrom, Jenkins, and Sorensen refer to earlier researchers who had attempted to investigate aspects of the Crawford disappearance. Howard Jenkins, a journalist for the Eureka Standard, had published a series of articles in 1938 revisiting the case on its 35th anniversary. After the third installment, which mentioned Jenkins's discovery of previously undisclosed witness accounts suggesting federal involvement in the suppression of evidence, the series was abruptly terminated. Jenkins himself resigned from the newspaper the following month and reportedly left California, leaving no forwarding address. Margaret Sorensen, an ethnologist studying Native American traditions regarding forest creatures in northwestern California, had begun comparing these accounts with the details of the Crawford case in 1942. Her research was interrupted when she was offered an unexpected position with the War Department, requiring immediate relocation to Washington, D.C. Her field notes and recorded interviews, which according to colleagues included substantial material related to Crawford, were never published and apparently did not accompany her to her new position, as they were not found among her effects after her death in 1964. The lingering questions surrounding Crawford's disappearance might have faded entirely from memory if not for a curious discovery made in 1963. During renovation work on a building in Eureka that had once housed a photographic studio, workers discovered a metal box sealed within a wall cavity. The box, apparently placed there deliberately, contained several glass photographic plates wrapped in oilskin and a journal with a single entry, dated April 16, 1903. The journal entry, written in what handwriting experts would later confirm, matched samples of Crawford's writing from letters held in private collections, read as follows: "Tomorrow I venture out alone. The sounds came again last night, closer than before. Not animal, not human, but something between. J.B., presumably James Blackwood, believes we should alert the authorities, but what would we tell them? That something watches us from the trees. That footprints appear overnight around our camp, larger than any man's. I came here seeking evidence, and I will not leave without it. The creature seems to be drawn to the flash of the camera. I will use this to my advantage." The photographic plates found with the journal were significantly damaged, having been affected by moisture that had seeped through the wall over the decades. When carefully developed by technicians from the university, only portions of the images were recoverable. What could be discerned, however, was deeply unsettling. Partial views of enormous footprints in muddy ground, a dark shape moving between distant trees, and most distinctly, what appeared to be a large hair-covered hand or paw reaching toward the camera in what seemed to be the final photograph of the sequence. The discovery sparked a brief revival of interest in the Crawford case. The Humboldt Times ran a feature article about the found materials on June 17, 1963, including reproductions of the least damaged photographs. Within a week of publication, the newspaper issued a retraction claiming that an expert from Sacramento had examined the plates and determined them to be elaborate forgeries, likely created as a publicity stunt by the building's new owners. This expert was identified as Dr. William Chambers of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. However, subsequent inquiries revealed that no William Chambers had ever been employed by the department. When pressed for details, the newspaper editor claimed the original materials had been returned to their owners, and he had no further information about the expert who had examined them. The building owner, Gerald Massey, vehemently denied any involvement in a hoax and expressed confusion about the newspaper's retraction. In a letter to the editor that was never published but was preserved among Massey's personal papers, he wrote, "I neither created nor planted the items found in my building. The suggestion that I would engage in such deception for publicity is both false and defamatory. Furthermore, no one claiming to be Dr. Chambers or representing any state agency ever examined the materials in my presence, despite the newspaper's claim that I witnessed this examination." Massey's letter went on to describe an unsettling visit he had received shortly after the discovery was publicized. Two men came to my office claiming to be from the State Historical Preservation Office. They said they needed to take custody of the items to ensure their proper conservation. They presented credentials that appeared official, though they did not leave me any receipt or documentation of the transfer. When I called the number on their business card the following day to inquire about when the items might be returned, I was informed that no such office exists at that address, and the telephone number is not in service. Massey died of a heart attack 2 months later. The photographic plates and journal discovered in his building were reportedly among his possessions, but when his estate was settled, these items were not listed in the inventory. His family members, when interviewed by local historians in the 1980s, claimed no knowledge of what had happened to them. The pattern established decades earlier continued. Evidence related to Crawford appeared, generated brief public interest, then vanished under mysterious circumstances, often accompanied by the involvement of unidentifiable officials or experts who left no trace in institutional records. The Crawford case might be dismissed as merely another frontier disappearance, unremarkable, except for the strange photograph and the curious pattern of vanishing evidence, if not for one final piece of the puzzle that emerged in 1967. During an archaeological survey of Native American sites along Redwood Creek, researchers from the University of California discovered a small cave whose entrance had been obscured by a landslide. Inside, they found evidence of recent human habitation, the remnants of a makeshift shelter, fragments of early 20th century clothing, and, most significantly, the rusted remains of what appeared to be a photographer's tripod. The archaeological team's report, filed with the university but never published, noted that the cave's location corresponded roughly to the area where Crawford's abandoned camp had been discovered in 1903. More disturbingly, they found that the rear wall of the cave bore dozens of crude drawings apparently made with charcoal and reddish pigment. The drawings depicted tall, bipedal figures surrounding a smaller, human figure. The team leader described them as reminiscent of certain Native American pictographs, but with an unsettling quality, suggesting they were created by someone in a state of extreme distress. Carbon dating of the charcoal used in the drawings placed their creation between 1900 and 1910, consistent with Crawford's disappearance. More precise dating was impossible with the technology available at the time. Among these items was a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be personal effects: a pocket watch, several brass buttons, a fountain pen bearing the initials TC, and, most intriguingly, a small notebook filled with what the report described as indecipherable writing, possibly in code or created by someone in an altered mental state. Before a more thorough investigation of the site could be conducted, the cave entrance collapsed completely during a severe storm in December 1967. The report included photographs of the cave interior and detailed sketches of the drawings, along with an inventory of artifacts found at the site. Subsequent attempts to relocate and excavate the cave in the 1980s were unsuccessful, leading some to question whether the original archaeological report had accurately recorded its location. The report itself became yet another victim of the Crawford syndrome. When researchers attempted to access it through university archives in the 1970s, they were informed that it had been removed from the collection due to questions about its scientific validity. The team leader, Dr. Samuel Foster, when contacted for a comment, claimed that he had been instructed by university administrators not to discuss the excavation publicly. By the time renewed interest in the case emerged in the early 2000s, Foster had passed away, and none of the other team members could be located. What adds another layer to the Crawford mystery is the testimony of Samuel Jenkins, a forest ranger who patrolled the area from 1903 to 1921. In his personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1938, Jenkins recorded numerous instances of strange occurrences in the vicinity of Crawford's disappearance. Most intriguing is an entry from October 1905, in which Jenkins describes encountering an unusual man deep in the forest. "Found a man today near Eagle Creek," Jenkins wrote. "Ragged, wild-looking fellow, thin to the point of starvation. He ran when he saw me. I pursued, thinking him a vagrant, or perhaps escaped from somewhere. When I called out, he turned for just a moment, something in his eyes, a look I've never seen in a man before, not fear, something deeper. He disappeared into the undergrowth with a speed that seemed impossible for his condition. Later found his shelter, a crude lean-to containing odd items, torn clothing of old-fashioned cut, the remains of what might have been photographic equipment, and strangest of all, pages and pages of drawings showing the same thing: tall, hairy creatures with elongated limbs. The detail was obsessive, as if drawn by someone who had studied his subject at length. Jenkins's account raises the tantalizing possibility that Crawford might have survived his encounter with whatever inhabited the forests near Willow Creek, but returned from the experience fundamentally changed, perhaps psychologically damaged by what he had witnessed, or possibly living among the creatures he had sought to document, as some more speculative researchers have suggested. Jenkins reported his finding to his superiors, but was instructed not to pursue the matter further. A week later, when he returned to the site with a deputy sheriff, the shelter had been completely dismantled, with no trace remaining of either the structure or its contents. Jenkins noted that the forest floor had been meticulously swept clean, as if someone had taken great pains to erase all evidence of habitation. This account remained unknown to Crawford researchers until 1956, when Jenkins's daughter provided his journals to a local historical society. By that time, the area Jenkins had described had been heavily logged, making any attempt to locate the exact site of the encounter virtually impossible. Another curious element emerged in 1942 when ethnologist Margaret Sorensen began collecting oral histories from Native American communities in northwestern California. Several of her Yurok and Hupa informants shared traditions regarding the Tall Ones, forest-dwelling, non-human entities that were said to inhabit the most remote regions of the landscape. According to these accounts, the creatures normally avoided human contact but occasionally developed an interest in specific individuals who ventured too deep into their territory. Sorensen's notes, preserved in the anthropology archives at Berkeley, record an elder's warning. They take people sometimes, not to harm them, but to know them, to learn about the outside world. Those they take are changed. If they return, they're never the same. They speak differently, act differently. It's as if something of the forest remains inside them. What makes this account particularly relevant to the Crawford case is the specific detail that follows. The old man told me that in his youth, he had heard of a white man who came to photograph the forest. The Tall Ones were curious about his device, which captured images. They took him to show him their ways, but he could not live as they did. When he tried to return to the human world, he found he no longer belonged there either. He became a wanderer between worlds, neither human nor forest being. While this could be dismissed as a folk tale incorporating elements of the known Crawford story, the timing of the original disappearance and the specific mention of photography suggest a potential connection to actual events. Sorensen herself noted the correlation, writing in her research journal, "The consistency between these traditional accounts and the documented case of the missing photographer is striking. Either the current stories have been influenced by knowledge of the historical incident, or the historical incident represents a recent example of a phenomenon that has been occurring in these forests for generations." Sorensen's research took an unexpected turn in September 1942, when she began focusing specifically on local reactions to Crawford's disappearance and the strange photograph he had captured. According to her correspondence with colleagues, she had located several individuals who claimed to have knowledge of Crawford's fate. Before she could document these accounts, however, Sorensen abruptly abandoned her research and accepted a position with the War Department. She never returned to anthropological fieldwork, and when contacted by Lindstrom in the 1950s, she declined to discuss her earlier research, stating only that some matters are better left unexplored. The most puzzling aspect of the Crawford case emerged in 1959 when a retired Forest Service employee named Harold Wilson came forward with a strange account. Wilson claimed that in the summer of 1905, he had been part of a small unofficial government team dispatched to the Willow Creek area to investigate reports of an unidentified species. According to Wilson, the team's actual purpose was concealed even from its members until they arrived on site. "We were told it was about logging rights and land surveys," Wilson stated in a recorded interview conducted by a journalist from the Oakland Tribune. "We were to locate and retrieve any photographs, journals, or physical evidence related to what the team leader called non-cataloged indigenous hominids. We were specifically instructed to look for anything left behind by a photographer named Crawford." Wilson's account included the claim that the team had indeed recovered additional photographic plates from a location he described as a hollow tree marking the boundary of their territory. He refused to elaborate on who they were, saying only that his team had been ordered never to discuss what they had seen during their 2 months in the field. But once we were in the field, our orders changed. Most remarkably, Wilson asserted that the government had been aware of the creature's existence since at least the 1850s, when similar reports had emerged during railroad surveys of the region. He claimed that official policy was to discredit witnesses, destroy evidence, and maintain public skepticism about the creature's existence. "It wasn't about preventing panic," Wilson said near the end of the interview. "It was about protecting them. Someone high up had decided they should be left alone. that humans weren't ready to acknowledge another thinking species sharing our world. Wilson's account included specific details that aligned with previously undocumented aspects of the Crawford case. He described the contents of Crawford's journal, which the team had allegedly recovered, including entries that matched the single page found in Eureka in 1963. He also referenced photographs showing closer views of the creatures than anyone had obtained before, claiming that these images clearly depicted facial features and expressions that were unsettlingly human-like in their intelligence and emotion. The Tribune never published Wilson's interview. The journalist who conducted it, Thomas Reed, was killed in a house fire 3 days later. The recording of the interview was presumed destroyed in the same fire, but a partial transcript surfaced in the 1980s among papers donated to a paranormal research organization. Attempts to verify Wilson's employment with the Forest Service or to locate any record of the team he claimed to have been part of have been unsuccessful. The Crawford case remains officially unsolved. Thomas Crawford is still listed among the historical missing persons of Humboldt County, his disappearance attributed to misadventure while photographing wildlife. No body has ever been recovered, no definitive explanation for the photograph has been established, and the systematic disappearance of evidence continues to invite speculation. What happened to Thomas Crawford in the forests near Willow Creek in April 1903? Was his photograph genuine evidence of an unknown species, as he apparently believed? Why did records of his existence seem to vanish in the years following his disappearance? And what are we to make of the curious pattern of misfortune that befell those who investigated his case too persistently? Perhaps most disturbing is the suggestion found in Lindstrom's water-damaged notes that Crawford's case was not unique. In a barely legible margin notation, Lindstrom wrote, "Similar pattern in Olympic Peninsula, 1897, Colorado Rockies, 1901, Adirondacks, 1904. Photographers or scientists venture into remote areas pursuing reports of strange creatures. Evidence initially emerges, then disappears along with the investigators. Government surveyors appear shortly afterward. Local phenomena cease." This notation hints at a broader pattern, a systematic process by which encounters with unclassified creatures are documented, suppressed, and ultimately erased from public record. Whether orchestrated by government agencies for reasons of national security, scientific institutions protecting established taxonomic paradigms, or some more obscure interest group, the effect has been to maintain official denial of creatures whose existence is attested to in folklore, witness accounts, and occasionally physical evidence that vanishes almost as soon as it appears. In the decades following Crawford's disappearance, the Willow Creek area would become known for similar reports, eventually earning the region its reputation as a hotspot for what would later be called Bigfoot sightings. The most famous of these, the Patterson-Gimlin film captured in 1967 near Bluff Creek, less than 40 miles from where Crawford vanished, would inspire decades of debate regarding its authenticity. In a little-known interview given to a local newspaper in 1969, Patterson mentioned that he had been partly inspired to search the area by an old story about a photographer who disappeared after capturing something on film. Patterson claimed to have tried to research this story, but found that records from that period were surprisingly hard to come by. Patterson's own experience following the filming of the creature at Bluff Creek bears certain similarities to the pattern established with Crawford. Few of those discussions, however, made any connection to the much earlier case of Thomas Crawford and his lost photograph. One person who did make that connection was Roger Patterson himself. Initial scientific interest in his footage was followed by increasing skepticism and dismissal. Physical evidence collected at the site, including plaster casts of footprints, was disputed or lost. Patterson himself died in 1972 before he could complete his planned book documenting the full context and aftermath of his encounter. Another investigation into the Crawford case was attempted in 1972 by journalist Catherine Stern, who had become interested in the story while researching a book on unexplained disappearances in national forests. Stern's research led her to a former employee of the Humboldt County Records Office who claimed to have seen the original Crawford photograph before it vanished from the archives. "It wasn't what people think of when they hear Bigfoot today," the employee, who requested anonymity, told Stern. "The figure in the photograph was tall, yes, but leaner than the creature in the Patterson film. Its proportions were more human-like, but elongated, and its face, what you could see of it, seemed almost hollow-eyed, as if deeply shadowed. The most disturbing aspect wasn't its appearance, though. It was the fact that it seemed to be looking directly at the camera, aware of being photographed. That's not something you expect to see in an animal image. It gave the impression of something not just seen, but seeing." The employee's description aligns with other accounts of the photograph from those who claim to have viewed it before its disappearance from official records. Dr. Morrison's notes, fragments of which survived the loss of his papers, describe the subject as having a distinctly non-human physiognomy, yet with an expression that suggests a form of awareness or intelligence that cannot be dismissed as merely animal. Stern's investigation was cut short when her research materials, including her notes from this interview, were stolen from her hotel room in Eureka. The theft occurred on the same night that a small fire damaged the county records office, destroying several boxes of historical documents that had recently been retrieved from storage at Stern's request. No suspects were ever identified in either incident. The Crawford case took on a new dimension in 1982 when Dr. Michael Weston, a wildlife biologist conducting research on bear populations in the Klamath Mountains, reported finding an unusual skull fragment in a remote canyon approximately 15 miles from the site of Crawford's disappearance. The fragment, which Weston initially believed might be from an unknown primate species, was sent to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The Smithsonian's preliminary report classified the skull fragment as anomalous but likely human, showing signs of abnormal development or pathological deformation. Before more detailed studies could be conducted, however, the specimen was reported missing from the laboratory where it had been stored. An internal investigation concluded that the fragment had been misplaced during cataloging and was presumed lost. Weston, who had retained photographs and measurements of the fragment, continued to argue for its non-human origin. In a paper submitted to the Journal of Anthropological Science in 1984, he presented a comparative analysis suggesting that the cranial proportions were inconsistent with any known human population but shared certain characteristics with higher primates. In a personal journal entry dated August 12, 1982, he wrote, "The location where the fragment was discovered corresponds to an area marked on an old forestry map as Disputed Territory, Survey Incomplete. Local informants claim this section of the canyon has traditionally been avoided due to associations with the forest people." One elderly resident mentioned a photographer who disappeared in the region decades ago, saying his intrusion into their domain had disturbed the balance. The connection to the Crawford case seems more than coincidental, given the proximity to his last known location. 3 months later, Weston's research cabin was destroyed by a fire attributed to a lightning strike, though weather records show no thunderstorm activity in the area on the date in question. The journal rejected the paper, citing methodological concerns and insufficient evidence. Weston's research notes included a specific connection to the Crawford case that was not mentioned in his formal paper. Weston himself was not present during the fire, having been called away unexpectedly by what proved to be a fraudulent emergency message regarding a family member. All of his research materials, including the photographs of the skull fragment, were destroyed in the blaze. The most recent chapter in the Crawford saga began in 2005, when digital restoration techniques were applied to a poor-quality copy of what was purported to be the original Crawford photograph, found among the effects of a private collector in Oregon after his death. The enhanced image revealed details previously invisible, including what appeared to be a second, smaller figure partially concealed behind a tree in the background. This figure seemed to be watching both the photographer and the larger creature in the foreground, creating an unsettling triangulation of gazes within the frame. The authenticity of this copy remains disputed, with some experts suggesting it may be a later fabrication based on descriptions of the original. However, photographic analysis has confirmed that it was created using early 20th century techniques, either as a period copy of Crawford's work or as a contemporary hoax of remarkable technical sophistication. If genuine, the presence of a second figure adds a new dimension to the Crawford mystery. Was he aware that he was being observed by more than one entity? Did he inadvertently document not just a single cryptid, but evidence of social grouping among an unknown species? And if so, might his disappearance represent not a random wilderness tragedy, but a deliberate response to his intrusion? The digital restoration also revealed another detail that had gone unnoticed in previous examinations: what appeared to be a structure visible in the deep background of the image. Described by analysts as an arrangement too regular to be natural, suggesting a constructed shelter or dwelling. This element raises the possibility that Crawford had photographed not just the creatures themselves, but evidence of their habitat and possibly their material culture. This interpretation aligns with certain Native American traditions regarding the forest people, which describe them as maintaining territories with constructed landmarks and seasonal dwellings. It also corresponds to James Blackwood's statement about areas that the local indigenous population considered to belong to the forest beings, suggesting a recognition of territorial boundaries that Crawford may have transgressed. The enhanced photograph generated renewed interest in the case among cryptozoologists and historians alike, leading to fresh attempts to locate any surviving evidence or documentation. These efforts have largely met with the same obstacles that hindered previous investigations: missing records, uncooperative officials, and a curious pattern of misfortune affecting those who pursue the matter too vigorously. One researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Chen of the University of Washington, attempted in 2008 to compile a comprehensive digital archive of all surviving materials related to the Crawford case. Her request for access to certain restricted collections at the Smithsonian was denied without explanation. When she appealed the decision, citing the Freedom of Information Act, she was informed that no records matching her description existed in the institution's archives, despite her having referenced specific catalog numbers from publicly available finding aids. Chen's project was further hampered when her university office was broken into, resulting in the theft of her computer and external hard drives containing her research data. Campus police classified the incident as a routine burglary, noting that several other offices in the building had been targeted the same night. However, nothing was taken from these other locations except electronic equipment, suggesting a possible attempt to acquire or destroy specific information rather than a theft for financial gain. Despite these setbacks, Chen's work has established more clearly than ever the systematic pattern of evidence suppression surrounding the Crawford case and similar incidents. Her analysis of document loss, witness silence, and official denials reveals what she terms a consistent methodology of information control that spans more than a century and involves multiple institutions and government agencies. The Crawford case represents not just an unsolved disappearance, Chen wrote in a 2010 article, published in an independent historical journal, but a window into a larger process by which certain categories of information are systematically removed from public access and institutional memory. The question is not merely what happened to Thomas Crawford, but why the record of his existence and his discovery has been so thoroughly obscured, and by whom. These questions remain unanswered, and likely unanswerable. The trail of evidence has grown too cold, too deliberately obscured by time and what appears to be human intervention. What remains is a haunting absence at the center of the narrative, The missing photographer, the vanished records, the lost photograph that might have changed our understanding of what shares the remote corners of our world. In the dense forests of Northern California, where the redwoods cast long shadows and the mist clings to the undergrowth long past noon, locals still speak occasionally of strange sounds heard after dark. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. Some claim that on particularly still nights, these sounds are accompanied by another noise, rhythmic and mechanical, like the clicking of an antique camera shutter echoing endlessly through the ancient trees. In 1969, the last known person to have seen Crawford alive, James Blackwood, gave a brief interview to a local historian shortly before his death. When asked directly what he believed had happened to the photographer, Blackwood was silent for several moments before responding. Some things aren't meant to be photographed. Some things don't want their image captured. In the old stories of my mother's people, to take something's likeness was to take a piece of its spirit. Perhaps whatever he photographed that day decided to take something in return. The single authenticated photograph attributed to Crawford, showing the blurred upright figure at the forest's edge, was officially listed as lost when the county reorganized its historical archives in 1968. Unofficial copies have circulated among researchers and collectors of unusual phenomena, though experts disagree about their authenticity. Each generation of reproduction loses definition, the image growing increasingly ambiguous with time, much like the truth about what happened to the man who captured it. As for Thomas Crawford himself, perhaps the most telling clue to his fate lies in that single journal entry found sealed within the wall in Eureka. The creature seems to be drawn to the flash of the camera. I will use this to my advantage. In his pursuit of evidence, did Crawford lure to himself something better left undisturbed? Did he, in capturing its image, provoke something that subsequently captured him? The forests keep their secrets. The records continue to vanish. And somewhere in the shadowed woodlands near Willow Creek, the truth about Thomas Crawford and what he discovered there remains hidden, like so many things just beyond the frame of what we can clearly see.